Uh, Hello, and thanks for joining CWS for another Wildlife Wednesday. Here, it's a pretty beautiful day in Palmer, Alaska. Thankfully, the wind let up. If anyone around the area has heard, it was quite the event over the weekend. They were calling for 95-mile-an-hour gusts and sub-zero wind chills. It was a lot of fun. Yes, thank everyone for joining us. My name is Jeff Stetz. I'm the Director of Science and Assistant Professor at the Center for Wildlife Studies. In part, one of the perks of my job is getting to help coordinate this series. Excuse me, where we invite our colleagues, fellow instructors, or researchers at the center to help share about the work they're involved with, their conservation efforts, the research that's going on, their education efforts, just to share what's going on. It's exciting for us. It's arguably the best part of my week. I always learn a ton, and it's great to get to interact with these people working around the world, including today. And today, it's my pleasure to introduce Tyler Nuckols. Tyler is a conservation social scientist who studies how issues of power and fairness shape relationships between people and the environment. For the past decade, he has worked across Southeast Asia and North America, including research on human-elephant coexistence in Thailand that blends community perspectives, indigenous knowledge, and environmental justice to develop solutions that support both wildlife and local livelihoods. Tyler prioritizes highly participatory projects, partnering with farmers and community groups to ensure that those most affected by conservation decisions help to shape them. As an educator, Tyler teaches courses on the practical and ethical challenges of conservation. It's no small topic. Training students and practitioners in tools like participatory research and justice-focused planning. His current work explores more restorative, community-driven approaches to conservation, guiding students toward practices that are both effective and socially just. Like I said, I'm sure I'm going to learn a ton today. So we're excited to have Tyler sharing his presentation with us titled Just Coexistence, Navigating Human-Elephant Interactions and Environmental Justice in Thailand. And with that, I will go quiet and turn it over to you, Tyler.
Nice. Thank you for that great introduction, Jeff. I appreciate it. Different weather here in Bangkok for sure. But yeah, thanks everybody for joining today. So I am Tyler, as Jeff mentioned. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Colorado Boulder. And I am sharing findings from my dissertation research in Thailand. I've been conducting this research since about 2022. Now kind of on the tail end, I hope, of getting this dissertation completed. But I'm going to share some findings from one of the approaches we used and connect this more broadly to environmental justice and the course that I teach with the Center for Wildlife Studies. So let's dive in. So I want to start with a quote from a farmer that I met. And this farmer grows pineapple, lives with elephants every day. And when I was asking him, what does fairness mean? What are his experiences with human elephant conflict? He said, why are our lives seen as worth so little? And he's talking about a story and an event he experienced. He said, the man the elephant killed, if he had been allowed to fight back without guilt, he might have lived. If he had a gun in his hand, that elephant might not have trampled him. But he couldn't do that because of the rules. Now he's dead, and the support offered can barely pay for food at his funeral. He said, we can't harm the elephants in any way, but from his perspective, they can harm people in the community without consequence. And he asked, is that justice? And that question really drives everything I'm going to share today and talk about today with you. We are talking about human elephant conflict, human wildlife conflict. We are discussing solutions a bit, but this question's different, right? This approach, this way of thinking is different. And my talk today and my research really seeks to drive at these kind of more hidden dimensions, these different aspects. Who decides that these communities should live with elephants? Who bears the costs? Who receives benefits? And fundamentally, is that arrangement fair? And who defines fair, right? What does fair mean? And this, drives us into kind of the paradox that we navigate in this situation in Thailand, right? Thailand's elephant conservation is a genuine success story. Wild elephant populations have increased, about 50% since 1990. We have now over 4,000 wild elephants across Thailand's major protected areas and forest complexes, and that's growing every year, right? It's truly a remarkable success. It's conservation working, but on the other side, last year in 2024, there were 4,000 damage reports across 30 of the 76 provinces. And there were more than 11,000 elephant sightings outside protected areas, and most of them were in farmland, people's fields. And between 2014 and 2023, there's been an estimated 189 people killed and 166 elephants killed. And those numbers are not as large as range states like Sri Lanka and India, but it's severe, right? And for many of us in the field of human wildlife interactions, we are thinking about the term coexistence, and there's been a great debate, a lot of contested conversation around what does coexistence mean, right? What are we aiming at? And for many, it's a catch-all, right? It's a state that we're seeking to achieve. But I mean, I want you to kind of think about here, is this coexistence, right? Is this an end situation, an end state, a result that we are working towards, right? For many in the community that I'm going to share with you today and introduce you to, I mean, coexistence is an everyday reality. And it's defined very differently depending on who you ask, right? What that means. So I spent about 2 years living in the community of Room Thai, Thailand. It's a small community that borders Khoi National Park. It's in the kind of like skinny bit, kind of like southern Thailand, but not the far south. And the community is unique. It is surrounded on almost all sides by the national park, which means that human elephant conflict is quite unpredictable. And it's a very large border for rangers to have to patrol every night. It's also a unique situation because this community hasn't been living with elephants for hundreds, of years. This community was established in the 60s and 70s, right? It's somewhat of a fairly new community established by the government to, create a scheme where landless farmers could move to this area, receive some land to farm, and it served government priorities in terms of buffering against a communist uprising in the South around this time. And so you've got about 738 households, about 2,000 people, and about 70% of these people depend on pineapple farming for their livelihoods. And in recent research by a colleague of mine, Avo, and there's been found that 90% of folks report negative consequences of living with elephants. These red dots on this map, this is data that I received from the Department of National Parks in Khoi that shows their reports of human elephant conflict in 2023 alone. You can see how these concentrate on the border. The border is unfenced. It's porous. And you have about 300 to 350 wild elephants living in this region. The Tourism Authority of Thailand promotes Khoi as having a 95% chance of seeing wild elephants when you visit. And they have a successful safari program that's community led where you can, go with community members as guides. It's fully community operated to see wild elephants ethically and safely. I mean, it's a great program. But if you're not in the tourism business, it's a tough life. Pineapples are highly attractant to elephants. They're a high conflict crop. Elephants love to eat pineapples. And as you can see from this camera trapping footage that we captured, an elephant can wipe out an entire pineapple field quite quickly in one night. One individual I spoke to said, that her husband had not stayed at home for the past 20 years. Every evening he would sleep at the farm to the point that his home had kind of become unfamiliar to him. She said, because our livelihood depends entirely on farming. We have to guard. It's not a matter of choice. If we don't, we, risk lose everything. 20 years of not sleeping at home. Is that what coexistence looks like? And there's a lot of different variables in this space that I'm going to walk through. And we can't get into all the complexity today, but this makes for a very unique place to study human-wildlife interactions and human-elephant conflict specifically. But when I initially, came to Thailand and came to Room Thai to conduct my research, doing a pilot season in 2021 and then moving full-time to the community in 2022, there's been a lot of work done in this community. There's been a lot of solutions proposed, a lot of work. And then I thought I would, be studying the typical stuff, right? Documenting crop damage, measuring economic losses, mapping incident patterns, camera trapping. But, early on through conversations, we started to realize that we were missing something fundamental, right? People weren't just tired. They were really fundamentally burnt out, not just from human elephant conflict, but from a lot of research, a lot of extractive research, where people would come in and survey them and ask them how they felt about elephants, what were their attitudes towards elephants, and there weren't any solutions, right? We found that, coexistence for a lot of people wasn't a neutral word. Some people had high perceptions about elephants, right? They built livelihoods around them, but others, were seeing them as a nuisance and a hazard and a daily, burden. And that division was pretty sharp, but also overlapped quite a bit, which was interesting. And we'll talk about it in a moment. But we also saw that there were a lot of meetings and a lot of workshops and a lot of opportunities for people to join, but the engagement was waning. The trust in these systems and these forums was not as strong as maybe it once was. And underneath everything, there was this sense of governance breakdown, right? A power imbalance, rules that were working for some people and rules that were like further disenfranchising others. And I have a background in community organizing in Colorado. I worked for Conservation Colorado in Denver, and I did community organizing around, fracking and the Suncor oil refinery, and working with communities who were living next to these polluting sources and were lobbying the government for change. And this looked familiar to me, right? These community members were living near a very dangerous situation, a very dangerous source, wild elephants. People had been dying in this community, and there was a lot of barriers that were keeping them from getting towards change. And so we wanted to understand what were those barriers and how people were navigating this. And so I don't want to bore you too much with the methods, but I lived in the community, as I mentioned, doing embedded ethnography for about 2 years. And this meant, that I was, doing my best to be involved as much as possible to understand the situation as deeply as I could. I was joining meetings, engaging in workshops, guarding crops, and helping with harvests, attending celebrations, trying to understand this as best I could as an outsider, someone from the United States who had not had a lot of exposure to this outside of a video or textbook or a research article, right? And so that was important. That really gave us a lot of insights. And my research assistant, Poom, my colleague, he helped us to conduct 40 in-depth interviews with key stakeholders. These were about hour-long conversations with people from 18 to 78 years old, and we got an equal gender split, 50-50, and we really looked for diversity. We talked to farmers and tour guides and rangers and restaurant owners, community leaders, people who were involved in the leadership of the tourism groups and alternative livelihood groups, village heads, NGO workers, right? We wanted to get as much diversity as we could. And we talked to people who lived, right near the park boundary, people who lived, a few kilometers away, different income positions. And Poom, these were hard conversations. And he conducted these interviews, and then working together, we worked with Mook, our other research assistant, and we did a dual language thematic analysis. So we looked through the interviews and coded them qualitatively with these codes that I'll talk about in a moment, looking at different themes. And then we did computational text mining to really see, is this an interaction, right? How do these environmental justice situations connect and overlap? And we found out that they interact systematically, as I'll explain. And our theoretical framework is based in environmental justice, right? As I've mentioned, and we stand on the shoulders of giants with this. And so we sought to build out a framework that applied 5 dimensions. And so we look at distributive justice, which is, the pretty common framing of environmental justice, harms and benefits, but also kind of a classical definition of justice. Again, I don't want to get too theoretical and run into the weeds too much here, but how are benefits and burdens allocated fairly across a community? We look at recognition, right? How are different identities, different ways of knowing, different vulnerable identities recognized or oppressed or ignored within conservation decision making? Procedural justice, the processes, right? The meetings, the laws, the transparency of the processes in general, right? Is it inclusive? Is it clear to participants? Is it is there follow through, right? Is it working as it's, supposed to, or described to work? And structural is the kind of umbrella, right? The systematic, the governance system as a whole, the political system, the larger laws, right? These underlying factors that kind of over encompass all the other justice dimensions. And we also added ecological justice, importantly, right? Justice for non-human beings, right? Thinking about fairness and responsibility for elephants as well, and the ecosystem, rooted in relational justice and indigenous ways of knowing. We wanted to see how that, connected within this situation as well. And what we found is that some of these dimensions carry more weight than others, but all of them were mentioned, and all of them played a part in how people experienced human elephant conflict, the governance, the conservation management in this system. And what we found is a term that we document in our research, and we termed it imposed coexistence. And this is really what shaped and surfaced from the data, right? So this is a researcher interpretation of what we saw, grounded in the literature, and how this is really different from collaborative coexistence or collaborative conservation. And so this is really a governance framework founded on legal asymmetries, one-dimensional hierarchies that prioritize elephant well-being and mandate living with wildlife, and systematically restrict communities' abilities to adapt, to respond, and really entrench vulnerability and marginalization that is, present within the social dynamics of many communities, but also, enforced through the burden of elephant crop damage and the struggles of smallholder farmers. In plain language, right? It's, kind of, if you must live with elephants, and you should protect yourself, but there's a lot of barriers, and support is there, but it's not really accessible, and you really can't change the rules, right? So coexistence in the literature is defined many different ways, but there's an implied choice, a negotiation, right? A mutual adaptation is emphasized, and what we documented is that was not present, right? There is no other option, and I'll explain why. So each one, surfaced differently from how people describe their experiences, and so we took the environmental justice dimensions that I'll mention on this slide and formulated those into these broader themes from the thematic analysis on how the coexistence or the governance or the conservation structure was working for communities. And the legal asymmetries is sort of the bedrock, right? The foundation, and the Thailand Wildlife Protection Act kind of sews that in, right? Is kind of the bones of it, right? It's up to 10 years in prison for any harm to elephants, even in self-defense. And there is not the same legal recourse when elephants harm a person. This quote says, "I think elephants have more rights than people. If elephants destroy our crops, nobody takes responsibility. But if we harm an elephant, many agencies come after us and want to put us in jail." And we saw this time and time again. If an elephant was killed, there was a media convergence, a ton of officials, a lot of governance response, a pretty flashy, a pretty big public outcry. But if a farmer died, it was a very different story. It was, quiet, and there was maybe a news story. Locally, the farmer or the family would receive a pretty meager compensation, from the national park or from the government. A lot of times the community would fundraise to support the family. And I mean, this dichotomy was really clear to people. We saw this surface in stories a lot about how, if an elephant dies, there's like a manhunt, right? There's an investigation to find who did this, right? But there's not the same situation for an elephant, right? There's very little follow up. They're not able to track the elephant in many cases. And so you see this sort of asymmetry set up of a hierarchy where elephants are perceived by many in the community to be more important to the public, to the government, to the overall conservation system. And then you have these really difficult systemic support barriers that are from historical legacies, from legislation and laws, but you have compensation programs that exist on paper, but they require a lot of red tape. And if you've worked, in the field across the globe, especially in Southeast Asia, maybe in Thailand, there's a lot of red tape. There's a lot of documents. There's a lot of, processes you have to go through with anything, right? And for all of these farmers, they don't hold the formal land title to their land, right? This is a program called the KTC program, the Kaw Chaw program, and they have a long-term lease to farm on this land, right? They were given this land to farm on it. They were allocated, everybody was allocated, different farm plots and a different housing plot in the community. Farmers typically don't live on their farms, but they can't sell the land. They can pass it down. There is some trading maybe amongst the community, but you're not really supposed to sell to outsiders. That's illegal. And because you don't have that formal title, we found that many folks, when they tried to seek compensation, would hit a gap because they didn't have the documentation once they went up the governance process at the provincial level or whatever level is issuing the compensation. They didn't have the required documents that they needed to produce. I mean, living here, meeting hundreds of people, I mean, I've never heard of anybody, I've never witnessed, I've never seen proof, I've never talked to anybody who's ever received compensation for crop loss. There's been folks who've received compensation for elephant harm, like injury, human bodily injury and death, but nobody I know or have talked to, or anybody that I talked to, hundreds of people have ever received compensation for crop loss. And so, I mean, that's a serious issue, right? That's a serious structural concern. And I mean, it's pretty well known, right, that this area doesn't have a relief fund in place. There is a national policy and there are, hopes for that, but there's no compensation for folks in this community, right? It's not bureaucratically challenging. It's literally impossible. And so anything proposed, like new solutions at a national level, insurance schemes, nobody in this community would be eligible for that, right? Unless there's a fundamental change with land tenure. And imagine how difficult that is. And that's not super unique to this area. There's other forest complexes where communities in Thailand live in the same arrangement. And some community members were very acutely aware of why they would not receive compensation, but other people just thought that, that it was just a total government's, that they didn't want to handle it, right? The government didn't care. And for a lot of people, even applying for compensation was a waste of time. Why would I even bother doing that anymore? We just pick up the pieces, rebuild, plan again, go from there. And we also saw participation theater, right? As I mentioned, there's a lot of participatory action here. There's a lot of workshops and different NGOs are here doing work. And there's lots of opportunities from the national park to have forums and discuss participatory mapping, lots of stuff. And people attend, but there's just this really common theme of that nothing ever changes, right? And a lot of times when folks are asked, it's tokenistic, right? There was an issue with the electric fence early on where, the national park was established in the 90s, decades after the community was established, because there was a huge amount of elephant killings in the region, and the government decided that something needed to be done. An electric fence was planned, but the authorities mandated that the electric fence needed to be placed on farmer land. The allocated land we just discussed, they don't have the land title to. It's already a limited plot. And so naturally, farmers were uncomfortable with this. They would lose land if the fence were to be built, right? They would lose their already small hectare acreage on their plots. And so they were asked if this would be okay. And then they were said no. And so it became this huge, sticking point between the NGOs, the DNP, the national park, and the farmers. And eventually the fence was built, but it fell apart because the community didn't support it. Right. And there's been future talks about a fence again, but it's always has to be on farmer land. And so there can never be consensus. Right. And so people are fed up with that. People said, what was the point of them even asking us if the rules are already set and the rules are unbending? And then there's this entrenched vulnerability and marginalization. And this is, this will tie into the networks that I'm going to talk to you about. So keep this in mind. But there's this compounding vulnerability of that those who are most affected, they can't even join these meetings or these workshops or diversify their livelihoods or join the tourism program, which is set up to, in theory, support farmers who are dealing with this. They are unable to diversify their crops or join the NGO programs to grow alternative crops like lemongrass or citronella. They're burdened. They're farming every day. Smallholder farmers are living on a knife's edge. That not only are they dealing with climate change and really difficult markets and all kinds of different things in geopolitics. They're also dealing with elephants every night too, right? And so, this quote was really illustrative. Those who are really troubled during the day, they have to work as laborers, farming on other people's land or working, in construction projects. And at night, they have to watch over their farms and farm their own farms at the same time. And so when it's time to join a meeting to voice their opinions or get involved, they have to work, right? They don't have a chance to come. And so all of these other, systems and this imposed coexistence are just, again, in this cycle that are blocking people out of change, of access, right? This is imposed coexistence. And, we tested whether these different types of environmental justice interact or operate separately. And so, again, I don't want to go too deep in the weeds here, but the environmental justice dimensions, through the thematic coding, distributional was the most prevalent in terms of how people talked about losses, lack of compensation, damages. Procedural justice was second in terms of frequency, in terms of decision-making processes, meetings. Recognitional justice was third in terms of the coding, and then structural and ecological. But when we did this, what's called term frequency inverse document frequency, and I probably lost half of you there with that, but it's a statistical method that uses natural language processing, and it converts the text into numerical representation. And this is to see how important a word is, right? And how it measures an importance compared to the corpus, the body of the interviews, right? So what we found is that each of these circles is a dimension of justice: procedural, structural, recognitional, dimensional, ecological, as we coded. And across thousands of passages where people talked about different problems, we saw how these co-occurred, right? And so we saw, when we grouped passages that were topically similar, we see that these structural procedural dimensions are the sort of the main sort of like arena setting, right? That's how they sit at the center. They connect to everything else. The structural barriers and the procedural barriers are conditioning everything else. The recognitional barrier, the recognitional injustices, were like a gatekeeper that kind of mediated between procedural, structural, and distributional justice. Distributional justice had strong connections to procedural and structural, but not to recognitional and not to ecological at all. Ecological only had a sort of structural connection when people were discussing this. And we did permutation testing where we shuffled the labels around 1,000 times, like shuffling a deck of cards, to see if this was, actually systematic or by chance, right? And so we found that, 5 of the 10 possible pairings really showed up significantly. And this really shows kind of how what we saw in the narratives and how we hypothesized from the living in the community, this is taking place, right? You have structural barriers like the compensation schemes, procedural barriers like these performative meetings that are mediating a lot of this, right? It's a systemic issue. Recognitional justice in terms of people who have more vulnerable livelihoods, less income, less social connection, being unable to join procedural meetings. Procedural and structural justice, really mediating distributional justice, benefits, support, and then ecological justice kind of sitting out here in the nebulous, because for a lot of folks, elephants are a state-owned resource. They're the state's problem. They're the national parks problem, right? There was this disconnect. There was a support for conservation. There was, pretty good perceptions for elephants, but very much seen as they should stay where they are. If they would just stay in the national park, or if there was just compensation, things would be better, right? So it really kind of boils down to, you can improve meetings all you want, right? You can have more inclusive processes, more meetings, better facilitators. We can have more innovative solutions and more livelihood schemes. But if the structural rules aren't fixed and are still mediating everything, everything's predetermined, right? We can't have the fundamental change that it was really obvious people wanted. People just wanted reliability, safety, as we'll talk about, and they just wanted compensation, anything, right? They just wanted a fence that could potentially be effective. They just wanted to see these things that they were taught, that was talked about, that were promised to them, actually happen. And tourism in this community is touted as like the coexistence solution. The Koibury model is is kind of well known across Southeast Asia. I mean, communities come from Indonesia, from Sri Lanka, from all over Thailand to see how Koibri does ecotourism. And by all accounts, I mean, it's great. I mean, it's one of the best experiences I've, ever had, viewing wild elephants, let alone with ecotourism. And I've worked in the captive elephant space for a long time. I've seen some bad stuff, and this is great, right? It really is community owned and operated. They have a really good benefit sharing system. I mean, there's a ton of autonomy. It's really well done. But there's a disconnect we found, and that is that the tourism club can only have so many people in it, right? They can't have everybody in it. And it's often mediated through social networks, and you have to have a vehicle in many cases. You have to be able to have some English language training. You have to have time to join this. A lot of people in the tourism club have diversified livelihoods, right? They have different circumstances. The most vulnerable individuals in many cases were not able to participate in that. And there was a stark divide in narratives, right? Tourism requires a lot of assets that the majority of the people who are most vulnerable don't have. And you see this in quotes, right? Those who work as guides, they love the elephants because elephants mean they earn money. But for those who only farm and have nothing else, when elephants trample their crops, they get angry and frustrated, right? How can there be any understanding between the groups? And we saw this resentment and this kind of divide amongst this really successful collective action. This has potential to mediate a lot of the injustices, but if these systemic issues are not addressed, if we're not thinking about how we can get more of the most vulnerable folks, the most marginalized folks involved in a solution, I mean, we're losing that collective organizing, right? We're losing that ability for change. And I mean, this requires a lot more unpacking and a lot more, surveying and getting a broader sample. But this is concerning that it seems like there's potential for elite capture and that potentially this could continue to cause divisions and a real feeling that a lot of the farmers are subsidizing conservation for the broader public, right? There was, conversations about, well, we just have to deal with this, right? So that elephants can serve future generations or that people can enjoy elephants. We just have to bear these costs, right? And you might say, well, why can't these people just move, right? Again, their most valuable asset is their land. They can't sell it. So they're just kind of trapped in this cycle of this situation. And tourism folks felt the same way, right? It wasn't as black and white as you might think. Tourism folks were also upset and wanted to see this change as well. So tourism really just complicated a lot within our data set. And it was surprising and really interesting. And importantly, we wanted to understand what did fairness mean for local community members, right? Are we just coming in and imposing our definition of environmental justice or fairness? And so we wanted to ask, and so we asked folks, what would be fair? What do you actually want? And 4 principles emerged across 95% of our 40 interviews, right? Reciprocity being the strongest, right? That they accept that the elephants need protection, but that humans need protection too. It needs to be fair. There shouldn't be this imbalance, right? There needs to be more symmetry and there needs to be reciprocity in that they feel like they're bearing a burden. They're taking on this responsibility of living and coexisting with elephants for the greater good. They should be reimbursed for their losses. They should be supported more, right? Also, institutional responsiveness and follow through. They want to see that it's not just performative. They want to see if there's going to be a meeting that something's going to be discussed, it's follow through, right? We're not just having paper meetings, right? That we're not just having these checkbox workshops, right? That there's actually meaningful follow through and that they can see that tangibly. Equality and non-discrimination, right? Being sure that it's not just the folks who have the most friends or the most resources or the, in leadership roles, that it's more even, right? That there are folks who maybe are a little bit more nervous to speak, at meetings who can be included more and have their voices heard. And then, again, that ties into recognition of multiple perspectives, right? That it's not just being told and that it's not epistemic injustice where you have just academics or researchers or officials telling what's to be done, right? That local ecological knowledge is heard and valued more, that the community has more veto power and the ability to say no, right? That these fairness principles are at the core of what they expect. And I mean, this really ties into legitimacy, right? And this is kind of at the core of a lot of these governance challenges, is that a lot of times in conservation, we assume that legitimacy comes from good processes, right? That we are having inclusive meetings, we, have a really good results chain, and, we've done our due diligence to do risk assessment. But, what about the substance? It's not just about the process. Is the governance perceived as fundamentally unfair? Do we understand what fairness means? What has happened in the past that might precondition the legitimacy of what we're proposing today? I mean, without legitimacy, it undermines compliance, regardless of how good the technical solution is, right? No matter how big the electric fence is, if people view the arrangement as unjust, it's not going to be sustainable. I mean, and if this is violated, it erodes trust for generations. We talk to people who, had experienced a violation 10, 15 years ago. That still was really strong in their mind. A promised intervention that didn't turn out the way they wanted, the electric fence situation where they felt that they were, being treated unfairly. I mean, people remember these things. They tell their children, their grandchildren about them, right? If we make these missteps, if we don't prioritize justice, I mean, we could undermine all future conservation work or any sort of, collaborative action in the future. And I mean, as we mentioned, there's a real scary potential to fragment already good community capacity, right? Like if there's already a strong collective action and we continue to introduce new programs and new ideas that are actually creating infighting, or we are pouring resources into like a tourism program and supporting these individuals who are already perceived as having more resources than others. We're not, seeking out the most vulnerable. We're not, understanding what is causing, this systemic challenges in the community. I mean, we might just making that worse and worse, right? We're actually undermining the capacity for the change that we might be seeking. Again, like if structural arrangements remain inequitable, if legal protections are one-sided, if compensation is inaccessible, if tourism benefits are concentrated, there's no amount of consultation that's going to generate legitimacy. And I mean, this really grounds into moral economy principles, which James Scott studied in 1976 in Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, a lot of Southeast Asian communities who were smallholder agrarian communities who were working in this sort of village economy and obligations and trust, reciprocity, safety. This all fed into the legitimacy of officials, of a governance arrangement, of a communal network. And we have to think about that, right? Just because something works in Wyoming or in Europe or in, Australia, that doesn't mean it's going to apply here. And that might seem obvious, but we do this all the time, right? We're always looking for panaceas and toolkits to apply, but there's major cultural differences here, right? That I myself as an outsider cannot understand. But we have to try and do this, right? This requires sustained engagement and a deeper understanding. And so, we can't just expect these solutions to evolve on their own, though, right? We have to interrogate, we have to think critically and get into these issues of injustice. I mean, conservation has a deep colonial and harmful history, right? Are we just repeating some of these processes? And we don't have time to talk about relational and restorative justice, but these are some approaches we can think about to fix things. But I mean, some of these things are just fundamental, right? Being more transparent, having better stability. Farmers love stability. They want stability, right? If you're going to say you're going to do something, do it, right? But risky solutions and big changes are not very appealing to farmers. How can we increase stability? We need to decrease transiency, turnover problems, parachute conservation, people dropping in to do research for 3 months, then leaving, right? I'm very privileged that I was able to live in this community for an extended period of time. I can confidently say that improved the quality of research we were able to conduct, right? The trust I was able to build, the things I was able to learn and hear. I mean, it's incredibly crucial. But funding cycles don't like that. Universities don't like that. It's difficult. How can we advocate for more, sustained engagement and also community empowerment to lead the research on their own, right? And to support and empower that capacity. We need more repeated and positive interactions, right? To show immediate results in a timely manner to communities, right? If compensation is an issue, how can we start looking today to figure out what could be some solutions? How can we start thinking in a organizing perspective to start helping the community advocate and lobby for that change, right? How can we show immediate tangible solutions, not a crop transition that might pay off in 3 years, right? We have to think about these different intervention points within that justice framework, within that network I showed you. And opportunities for discretion, giving communities more power to say no, to decide, to have autonomy over the decisions, free, prior, and informed consent, right? That's so fundamental. And it's hard for conservation organizations and for funders and for government entities to cede that power. But for communities that completely feel disenfranchised over and over and over and over again, I mean, these all start to look similar, right? Somebody comes in and dictates what to do, and then they're supposed to do it and follow it through. I mean, we have to create more opportunities for empowerment. We can't just again expect only a seat at the table, only a consultation to achieve that. And that, I mean, that ties into justice informed methods, right? And this ties into a great promo for the course that I'm going to teach, right? We have to think about how we can do this differently, right? So asking ourselves, right, do like laws or policies, these are basic questions, but do laws criminalize defensive action without civil remedy? Are we prioritizing species over humans? Are we thinking in a single dimensional, myopic, only focusing on our biodiversity topic or our biodiversity target while ignoring human well-being outcomes? Can we bring more social scientists and ecologists and biologists together to do more interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work? I mean, do support programs require things that people just literally can't provide at the most basic level? And how are we thinking about getting to the folks that we know need the support the most, right? Of course, the folks who have diversified livelihoods, who have more money, who have more time, they can fill our conservation program roster and look really good on a report. But I mean, are we just kind of reinforcing the same systemic injustice, the same exclusion that we're seeking to remedy and support the farmers who are actually dealing with this, in a different way? Are we understanding those different profiles? And I mean, is there actually change possible, right? Are we actually holding up to what we offer? And how can we work together with community members to hold those above us, more accountable, right? To hold their feet to the fire in some situations. So again, January 5th, I'm teaching environmental justice and conservation through the Center for Wildlife Studies. And if you want to understand this more, go through more frameworks to understand environmental justice, practical tools like power mapping, really understanding what informed consent means, what truly participatory engagement could look like. I would love to have you there. We'll dive deeper into these examples. We'll talk about this research, but also examples from across the globe. We'll dive into the roots of the environmental justice movement, from the civil rights movement to the burdens and experiences of communities of color across the globe, indigenous communities who are still fighting these battles every day, and who, we are lucky to be able to learn from them. And so again, my final message is just, conservation isn't neutral. And a lot of folks don't want to hear that. And a lot of folks, don't want to hear that the research we do isn't neutral. It's very difficult when we're doing community-based, community-engaged conservation to think that what we're doing is subjective, or that is, not value laden, and that we're not bringing power and our own positionality to these spaces, right? And we shouldn't let perfection get in the way of progress, but we need to be honest about those impacts, right? And are we designing governance that is thinking about these systemic harms that could actually create transformative change that we see today is more and more needed as we run up against these wicked problems and these unyielding, very hostile systems to some of the work we do. So again, that's what environmental justice demands. I would make the strong argument that's what effective conservation requires in the future. I hope that was instructive. I hope that was interesting. Yeah, that's all I have. I'd love to take some questions and talk more. But yeah, thanks.
That was great, Tyler. We have one quick question in the chat so far. Please, folks, feel free to turn your camera on, raise your hand. We see Paul up there. Maybe first answer the question from Tori. Can you repeat the name of the statistical model you used for the EGAS system?
Absolutely. So we did TF-IDF, which is term frequency in document, or inverse document frequency. It's a vectorization method within the domain of natural language processing. So we essentially developed some nice Python code, drawing from a lot of different folks who have engaged in this, and then ran it through with that permutation testing. So I'm happy to talk more, but it is quite it's quite dense, and it's not really a very common like lexical analysis tool. But for our use case, it was really good to be sure that we were not, you know, making the only, myself and my research team were not making the only interpretations of how these communities were defining and talking about justice and these justice interactions. It's not possible, and I don't want to say this at all, yields towards causality. Right? We can't really prove causality in this situation, but we can see these interactions statistically, and the model is sound in terms of that. And I also do want to mention I should have also positively mentioned this in the beginning, but it would be really good. Please don't take any screenshots or share this. This is still ongoing research. We're looking to publish this soon, so please don't put any of our data out or quotes out into the world. Yeah.
Paul had a question. See you on video.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me, Tyler?
Yeah.
Excellent. It's impressive. It's going to be a great PhD. Impressive stuff.
Thanks.
I want to ask a bit about the tourists. Are these kind of like foreign, well-heeled, or backpackers, or I guess native tourists? What is, and is there possible for like a surcharge going directly to farmers? I mean, it's
Yeah.
takes organization, of course, as you know, but just
Yeah.
please.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the tourism folks are diverse, right? So you do have international tourists, you have more high end travelers, you do have backpackers. You also have a lot of Thai nationals and Thai folks coming to see elephants in this national park as well. So it's really diverse. I didn't study necessarily like the demographics, but from being in the national park a lot, you really do see a huge mix. You also see a lot of schools, a lot of Thai schools coming. Bringing kids down to go on the safari, and there is a surcharge, right? And so a lot of the money does go back into the pockets of the local community. That's a really remarkable aspect of the tourism model. But because of many limitations, as you can imagine, it can't go to everybody. And this is seen and visible for folks, especially folks who don't get any of those benefits, right? So most of the money returns perceived in the interviews to the folks who are driving, guiding, engaged in the tourism program. Everybody we talked to who wasn't engaged, we asked them, do you see any benefits? And nobody said they did. Everybody said, I don't know where that money goes. I don't see that money. Now, the community and the tourism program does have communal support programs. They have a fund for human injury, human death. They typically donate to families when something happens. They support with flashlights every year. They engage in projects that are community based in terms of HEC mitigation. But it's a small scale program that is trying to fill a very big hole that really only systemic governance can solve. Many in the tourism club mentioned we can't afford to pay for everybody's crop losses. We would lose all the income in our community enterprise in one night, right? With the amount of crop losses that are occurring. And so it's a strong collective action, and I don't at all want to frame this community or these individuals as passive victims. They are incredibly engaged in this organizing and collective action. It's kind of been shoveled onto them. This works. The tourism model works. This is going to be the solution. And for a lot of folks engaged in the tourism and outside the tourism, this is pushing the boulder up the hill constantly in terms of Sisyphus as an allegory. Yep.
All right. Thanks. Good luck.
Yeah. Thanks. So there's a question. Can you please explain the z-scores you calculated for the links between different EJ indicators? Yes, absolutely. So the z-scores are showing the weight of the node size in terms of their frequency in the sample. And so the z-scores are showing the edge thickness of the interaction strength between the nodes. So the node size is the weighted degree. So that's the sum of the z-scores in terms of how these dimensions surfaced. And then the node color is the influence of them in the network. And then the edge thickness is the interaction strength between the nodes. And then Nicole asked, the study was focused on one community. Based on your experience, how widespread do you think situations like this are? And do you believe prioritizing conservation at the expense of human communities has contributed to the push away from environmentalism occurring in some governments today? This is a really good point. Yeah, it's this one community. And it is a unique community, as I mentioned. And what we have learned here very likely has, in terms of, applying environmental justice, a lot of use. And our publications will seek to demonstrate that. We have a toolkit that we have used in climate change situations that I worked on with collaborators. I was a collaborator on that work, looking at flood buyouts and equity in terms of flood buyouts. And so we have a toolkit that we're developing for conservation and human wildlife interactions. But I would say that this would be incredibly unique depending on which community you look at, which again pushes for this critical inquiry and this justice informed work. I mean, with human wildlife interactions, somebody's experience could be completely different from their neighbor's experience, right? And this is a daunting task of getting this deep data and building this trust. I do think it would be hard for me to posit if this is, leading to this kind of shift away, but there is a host of body of research that shows, why a lot of folks in many communities who live adjacent to protected areas are fed up with conservation, and how conservation and environmental work continues to make these fortress conservation and missteps of the past, and do new harms and new forms of harm. I mean, there's lots of arguments by Boucher and Fletcher in the conservation revolution, around, if we're continually proposing market-based solutions like ecosystem services and tourism that are entrenched within the system that is doing harm in the first place, can we actually ever find a top side to that if we're looking for corporate sponsorship all the time and things like that? I don't know, I don't want to go on a tangent of that, but that's quite deep. But yeah, it's tricky, and I think that this is why we have to engage in these critical tools. And I mean, there are lots of pushes for more JEDSI incorporation and more FPIC in planning. I work now with the Zoological Society for London, and we are working on these fairer guidelines for all conservation programs to take these things into account in planning. But I do worry, especially as a US academic, as I see, environmental justice, diversity, these terms now on blacklists, that we will start to think that this work is trivial, or that it, isn't, this is super valuable, right? We've identified like a very serious issue in this community that is a major blocker for, safety of elephants and humans. And if we are, not able to get funding for this work, it's very difficult. I hope that answered. If you have another expansion on that, feel free to like unmute, and we can go back and forth on that a little bit.
Any other questions out there? Oh, Paul, another question.
Yeah, I wanted more. You spoke a bit about citronella, a bit more about sort of alternative crops. I know farmers, like I said, it's time and money, not enough of either. But I guess, is there any potential for less, elephant sort of palatable coffee or aquaculture even, or?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's actually what I set out to study when I got here, is we were, deploying a lemongrass and citronella program. And so there was previous work that had tested these crops, again by my colleague Ave Owen, in the same community. And this was a community-based research program. The communities picked the crops, they maintained them. And another forthcoming publication, maybe another talk I'll give in the future, is why that is so incredibly difficult. And again, how it's very difficult to create a systemic solution within these market systems, right? The farmers growing the lemongrass and the citronella were really trapped in these cycles of, not being able to meet standard protocols. Like fair trade required you to grow the crops first and demonstrate you could do it before you could join the program. And the farmers were like, why would I do that, right? Why would I shift from pineapple if I don't even know how much you're going to pay me, right? I'm not going to flip all my crops until I know that I can get the certification and get the value added price. And so we got in this Ouroboros of farmers, being like, well, I'm not going to shift until I get an idea of what the money I'm going to make. And the certifiers who would make the crops valuable by the value added component of it saying, well, until you show us you can do it, we can't consider you for our program. And so we got trapped in that situation. And then we also just, really found that the globalization of agriculture is very difficult. And there are just so many large scale factory producers out there that, the smallholder who's has no experience growing lemongrass or limited experience, only growing a few hectares of lemongrass, can't compete with these other areas in Thailand or globally or regionally that have, giant plantations of lemongrass, right? Lemongrass kind of just grows as a weed for many places. And so, the factories would fill their quotas so quickly that, getting this to be profitable was really difficult. And for the farmers, again, another forthcoming publication in my second chapter of the dissertation, but for the farmers, there was this subsistence ethic, right? This idea, again, from James Scott in The Moral Economy, that subsistence ethic, although, they're not growing these crops for subsistence, they're growing them for household well-being and household survival and livelihood. And so if even though there's this risk of pineapple, right? It's kind of like, the devil kind of thing, right? They know how to grow pineapple. They've done it for decades. And they know they can sell it. The factories are in the province. Dole was one of the biggest fruit factories in this region. And that's one of the biggest reasons that pineapple is grown here. But they know they can sell it to anybody there's even, buyers on the side of the road who will buy it. So even with the losses, that in terms of the subsistence ethic, in terms of the risk of the farmer mentality, is almost better than taking on this giant risk of changing crops, because in any sort of crop transition, the agricultural economic data, shows there's this loss. There's this very difficult adoption program where you're having to do a lot of inputs. You're having to sink a lot of intangible costs, time, learning, stress into it. And sometimes that's just not worth the risks of pineapple. And so I don't think alternative crops are a non-starter. I think, again, this is one context. They are seeing success in Sri Lanka and India with some of these approaches, but it really depends on these systemic barriers again. And how is the market? How are farmers' income stability, right? I think if farmers had a compensation program that could buffer some of the losses and, make more of a cushion for them in this community, there might be more success around alternative crops. But when you're operating on a razor thin margin, for many folks, this is just a non-starter idea right off the bat.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I know we're getting close to an hour. If you've got time, Tyler, there's one more question in the chat.
Yeah. So they said, I'm wondering how might you, your collaborators, any community leaders position the results of the research and pursue some of the financial restitution they've been systematically denied? Did your research point to any structural barriers that could be pressured to change? Absolutely. And so we have, worked very closely with the community to share back results. We, have this, really strong evidence from the livelihood group who transitioned, the barriers that they encountered, and have empowered them through documentation sharing and through capacity building to be able to share their stories and also to advocate for changes within that alternative crop space. And that's ongoing. I live in Thailand, and so that engagement is ongoing. I think in terms of this first paper, which we're still working on, we have done a member checking and a share back with community members on this topic. And I think that there is the ability to do some lobbying. We have already tried to connect to some political candidates in parliament to push forward this issue. But it's very difficult. And again, like I don't have rose-colored glasses on thinking that this is going to solve everything, right? But I think there are important discussions being had. There, is now quite a strong understanding with NGOs in this country, not only related to our work, but drawing from it, that we have to see some land tenure changes before insurance, which is being proposed, or any of these situations can work. And now that I'm at ZSL making those, advocating for that in those spaces. But this community again is really engaged, and they are doing a lot of knowledge sharing with other communities. And so we want to provide like a packet that they can use, like a kind of like an organizing toolkit to be able to engage with different stakeholders, and show the data and explain the situations they're facing. There have been documentaries made. I'm very interested in finding a documentary filmmaker who might be interested in coming to depict this side of things. But also it is risky sometimes for us to engage in this work as well in the spaces that we work within. And so we do have to also tread a little bit lightly in terms of the government, and things like that in Thailand. But this is ongoing. And so we'll keep working towards that. I'll also open to any ideas too. Drop me an email if there's any ideas you have about how we can increase, the efficacy of our findings and use it as an organizing and empowerment tool. Please, let me know as well. I'd love to collaborate more with folks on this topic.
Coincidentally, our previous presenter, Justin Grubb,
Yeah,
seems like a very, very successful wildlife filmmaker. Right here in his
absolutely.
alley. Maybe a great, great synergy. Um, I can only imagine how great your class is going to be, and I'm not saying that as someone who
Thanks.
promotes things readily. Looking at the
Thanks.
registration list, we have people from Peru, Zambia, India,
Yeah,
Pakistan, South Korea, Great Britain, France. I think the conversations that people could expect and the breadth of experience and perspective, I hope I get to take it myself, to be honest. Um, so yeah,
we'd love to
information's
have
there.
you.
We put links in there. If people have questions, please feel free to reach out to us anytime. I know I'm going to wrap things up because we're a little bit after 2:30. Well, my time, 2:30, a little bit after the hour. Um, Here also is one last link to the playlist on YouTube. I will get this posted, Tyler's presentation posted here in the next day or so. Please feel free to share it with folks. Obviously, this is a immensely important topic. Would As someone who tends to work just on the quantitative side, I recognize that we don't do anything compared to the kind of work involving communities and actual on the ground conservation. So thank you to people like Tyler who make things actually happen in the real world.
Sure.
And yeah, I really hope I get a chance to see more of this myself. For folks who may be interested in our next presentation, about a month from now, Dr. Laura Jimenez will be talking about advanced methods for modeling and predicting and mapping species distribution. That should be another fantastic talk. Um, and as always, if people have any suggestions, requests, preferences for anything from our group, whether it's different presentation topics, different courses, just want to reach out with questions, please do so anytime. And again, thank everyone for attending today and participating. Great to see so many folks show up. And most of all, thank you, Tyler, for taking the time and sharing some of this just incredible work with us.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it for the platform. And yeah, thanks everybody for joining. I hope to see you in the course.